And we are live. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Deep Partnership. I'm incredibly excited to have Nelson Wang on today, who is the head of worldwide partnerships at Airtable and who's built 0 to 1 partnerships at 5 different companies for the last 17 years. That's like an incredible wealth of experience, and I'm so excited to chat about it today, Nelson. Before we get started with the 3 key partner principles, which is the topic of today, I just wanted to ask you quickly, what made you decide that you wanted to start a newsletter of partner principles and share those learnings from the last 17 years?
I would say over that time period, I felt really lucky to learn from really incredible people from, all sorts of different companies. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was to pay it forward, because having spent that much time in partnerships, I just felt there's so much information that I've learned from each person that I just want to be able to pass on to other folks so that they don't go through the same pain that I did when I was first learning partnerships from the very beginning. So the key there is just to share as many lessons as I can to make it easier for other people as they start partnerships and grow into different roles within partnerships too. So it really comes down to giving back.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, yeah, that's kind of what inspired the show as well, because when I started 4 years ago, not as much experience as you, but 4 years ago, there was basically no content about partnerships. It was really hard to find something about partnerships. And the only way to learn was to actually hit people up on LinkedIn and ask them hey, do you have half an hour to tell me about partnerships, which was a very inefficient way of learning. And so I'm glad that people like you are actually putting in the time to then write blog posts and newsletters, etc., to help people who want to break into partnerships and help others learn and develop. Cool. If you are watching this live, I want to let you know that we are taking questions from the audience. So just drop your questions into the chat if you have anything for Nelson. And with that, let's get into the first partner principle. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the first partner principle, be customer-centric?
Yeah, this is something I feel is so important when you first start building partnerships, is you want to sit down with your customers and interview them and really learn about them, right? Who is the economic buyer, the personas, what functions, what verticals are they? And also specifically, what's their current state and how do they get to future state with you, and what are the business outcomes that you're driving? And along that journey, as they go from current to future state, what are the pains and challenges that they're going through in great detail? Not just high level, but really understand the problem set and, hear it with their specific language, specific to their function, their vertical, etc. And by deeply understanding the problem set, what you're going to be able to do is to better understand how you can map the right partners to solve for those and help them along the journey to get to that future state. And so in one of the partner program builds I did from 0 to 1, for example, in the very first month, one of the things I did was sit down with 10 of our largest customers to really understand what are those pain points and, to hear about the challenges firsthand. And that was tremendously insightful. You get qualitative learnings that are sometimes really hard to see in the data, and both are important for different reasons. So what those interviews allow you to do is to complement the data-driven side of things, the quantitative side, and to ultimately help you understand the full story of what the customer is experiencing. And then from there, combining that with data and your ICP, you can really come up with a very strong point of view on what an ideal partner profile should look like. And then that allows you to then recruit the right partner, onboard them, and then to go to market with them successfully together. So that's literally the number one thing I would recommend is start with the customer before you do anything with partners.
Yeah, I think that's often forgotten, right? Because you come into a new role, you're hired to do partnerships, and your first assumption is, I need to talk to partners. I need to get out and actually build this partner program. But oftentimes you don't actually know what to build, right? And it's the same mistake startup founders make, where they have a great idea for a product and then they go out and build the product and only when they have it, they start talking to customers. And so I've done that mistake in the past. And I also learned that it's really hard to interview customers well, like to actually understand what they need. So I wanted to ask you, like, how do you like structure your discover meetings? Like, how do you actually structure these 10 meetings with those enterprise customers?
Yeah, for those specific meetings, it's really about understanding, for example, one, how do you currently use the platform today, right? And what current state were you in prior to using the platform? Describe what that was like. How did you then put in the platform? What were the challenges in doing so? And then as you adopted that technology, what was the future state that you wanted to achieve? Where did you actually land? And ultimately, what were the business outcomes that you drove? And so you really want to deep dive into each of those to really understand what's happening within the customer journey. And I'll give you a very specific example. Let's say the customer says, hey, I rolled out this platform because currently our workflows are highly manual. We're spending 100 hours building this out with our teams. We're throwing a lot of headcount at it as we continue to scale up. And what's happening, for example, within our HR function is, ultimately we're not able to drive a lot of automation. So the platform should hopefully solve for that and basically reduce all these manual hours that we're spending on generating these custom workflows. In launching this platform, one of the issues we had was actually discovering what are all the workflows that we need to solve for, and then actually designing the new solution, and then actually implementing it and building that specific app that we're looking for, and then getting the customized training, the change management, and the ongoing support that we need. And so right there, the customer is telling you, as an example, hey, we need some professional services, right? Potentially from partners to be able to get us from current state to future state to ultimately land at the outcome. And then what you want to really dig deep on are what are those outcomes in specificity, right? So if it's time savings, how many hours per person are you actually saving on a weekly basis? If it's driving revenue, exactly how much growth could that drive on a week over week basis, as an example? So getting very specific on that is super helpful because it really helps you understand the true impacts of the business. And that's something we always want to try to uncover as well in that discovery meeting.
Yeah. Have you ever had it that like customers will come to you and say, hey, we want to work with partners, or was it more you connecting the dots? Because I feel like that's big issue as well, right? Like you have to actually read between the lines instead of like having a customer say, hey, I want to work with an agency. Because I feel like when I'm a customer and I hear like, hey, you should work with an agency, I immediately think that they're going to charge me a lot of money. So you probably need to read between the lines to understand like what customers actually want. They won't tell it to you straight up.
That can definitely be the case. That's one thing I've heard. Another one is a customer already going to another partner and saying, I've already purchased these services because I had these challenges. And then the other one is the customer asking if we have any type of partner recommendations for the problem set. So definitely have heard all three of those scenarios pop up. And yeah, definitely would agree that the one you mentioned is one that's very common.
Yeah, that's also a great question, actually. Is like, do you already work with a partner, right? It's also something you can train your AEs on and just ask them like, hey, ask your customers if they already work with agencies or any kind of service like provider. Even if it's for like a different software, they might actually be an agency which could, work with you as well because they have a complementary skill set, or they already work with something else which integrates with Airtable and your solution.
That's right. And having them ingrain that into the discovery process is so powerful because when they're able to uncover who that partner is that already works with that customer, already has a relationship, likely already has an MSA in place, it can really accelerate that partnership incredibly quickly. Because then you can go to the partner and say, oh, one of your customers has a specific challenge. We'd love to engage and talk about how we can build a better together solution for them.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you mentioned something else like in your explanation of the first partner principle, and that's like the development of an IPP. How do you find out like who is the ideal partner profile? Like how do you know that this is kind of like an agency you want to hand out to your AEs, and then they go with the IPP and just like start acquiring more of these agencies?
I have a visual that I'll share that will explain this. And I'll pull that up right now.
Okay.
So I'm just going to check. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So when I think about IPP, the foundational element is oriented around your customers, right? And so you can think about the layers with that, like economic buyer, personas, vertical, function, segment, right? problem set that they're solving for, et cetera. And so that is always the most important foundational piece to start. Now, layered on top of that are capacity, capability, and commitment. This is what I call the 4Cs framework, which I recently modified from 3Cs based on some great feedback on LinkedIn, of which you saw, I know. But the 3 other Cs, right, outside of customers, are 1, capacity. So these are some considerations. And the reality here is the answers to this are context dependent on every company. Because what I have noticed is every company is unique in its own way. And even if they're literally competitors on the same type of technology, and maybe even on the same segment, there are still unique differentiators per company, which I always found fascinating. So really, the specifics of this will depend on your company, but things to generally think about in terms of capacity: employee size, the size of their sales team, the number of consultants, the size of their services bench, if you're doing services partners as a go-to-market, their reach from a digital presence perspective or from a regional presence perspective, like do they have offices locally in EMEA versus Americas versus Canada, et cetera. Their portfolio of customers based on segment, number of employees, revenue, vertical. And then on the capability side, do they have existing practice areas that lend well to your platform based on customer need, right? And I listed some examples here. There's obviously, probably hundreds of different practice areas. And then also, what is the, oh yeah, so
sorry, no, I actually wanted to dig down a little bit on capacity and reach. Like, how much do you think does it matter that like an agency or a service partner actually has a digital presence and is already out in the market versus somebody that you can funnel leads to, right? Do you think there's a distinction? Like, are these two different partners, or does it depend on what your goals are with this partner program?
That's exactly it. It depends on the goals you have for the partner program, oriented around the customer. So I'll give you an example. If your customers are, heavily struggling with services delivery, and you need partners to go do that extremely well for them, then digital presence may not be as important as one of your prioritization weights, right? But the other component to think about is it's not mutually exclusive either. Like, you could have great service delivery partners that also have a really great digital presence. And that might be a sweet spot because not only can they deliver for the customer outcome on the services side that they want to get to, but the other component is, for example, once they have a great outcome, they could share that case study, for example, on LinkedIn and get a lot of visibility on that. And so but having both would certainly be wonderful because one will drive the outcome for the customer on a services perspective, while the other drives reach and potentially helps you acquire new logos, gives you more brand awareness and so forth. So I think the answer is it's context dependent, but they're certainly also not mutually exclusive.
Awesome. And I see we just had Clinton join us in the chat. Clinton, thanks for joining us live today. And we are also pumped for this session. I wanted to ask you another question about the IPP framework. How do you quantify it? How do you go out to your PMs? Like, you've managed teams of partner managers before. How do you explain to them, like, these are the 4 Cs you should look at? And how do you make sure that they can actually quantify it and say, like, okay, we should invest in this partner versus that partner? Or is it more based on like a gut feel of this kind of looks like they fulfill the criteria?
Yeah, I think what's really important is you want to socialize these principles internally, just to make sure that, one, there's agreement on what the principles are, and if not, what modifications or feedback they would give to get agreement across the board. And then the key is, if everyone is aligned to the principles, you can then orient everything else downstream to get to the outcomes. And so I think a big part of it is the open communication, the discussion around it, also the consistency, right? I think that's really big. Is you want to not only openly communicate it, but be consistent in the way you think about the principles and discuss it internally, so that everyone is consistently reminded of what you're oriented around as well. So I think that part is really important.
Interesting. And how does that change depending on the company size? Like, one thing which I find so interesting about your story is that you joined Airtable, which is a large company with a lot of customers already, to build out partnerships 0 to 1. How did that change at Airtable compared to like the companies you worked before, which were maybe like a little bit smaller and more nimble? Like, how robust does that framework need to be, or that system need to be when you acquire these partners?
I think whether you're small or large, having really great principles as a starting point is so important. And that's because principles are the foundation to all the frameworks you're going to leverage within your partner program, no matter what partner type you're working on. And so that's why I'm a really big believer in just making sure you're super crisp on what the principles are and making sure that you communicate those internally. And then I think the key is, certainly if you're at a small startup that's just beginning with partnerships, the build is very different than like if you went to a large company that has, 20 iterations of a partner program already done. And specifically, I'll speak more so to the 0 to 1. That's generally where I get more questions from people about, how to approach like a 0 to 1 partnership program build.
Yeah.
And what I would say there is, really start with having the principle set, being extremely customer oriented to figure out the ICP, then building the IPP based on the ICP. And then from there, basically you'll want to recruit, enable on board, and then go to market. And the other components of this is as you go through those pillars, you want to think about setting the right expectations internally regarding crawl, walk, run. So in the beginning, you'll really want to measure typically like leading KPIs that get you to where you want to be, for example, a year out. And an example of that would be, hey, look, in the very beginning stages, the first step is, do the customer interviews, right? Develop the IPP. We're then going to, formulate a program off of that. And also then start to recruit partners through like an outbound motion as an example, and also have like an inbound application set up for incoming partner interests. And so like that might be your crawl phase, and your leading KPIs on that might be, did you develop that ICP and IPP? Did you develop a partner program? Did you stand up an inbound application process for partners? Are you starting the outbound process and have a list of partners that you're reaching out to? And how many of those did you actually recruit and onboard and certify or accredit? So, that might be stage one, and then stage two might be a different set of KPIs based on where you are in the maturity of the program. So I think the key there is to paint that picture of what that vision looks like beginning to end, whether it's like a year out or 3 years out, however much you want to, forecast, and then ultimately show them the different stages and leading KPIs that are tied to each stage of that journey.
Got it. And I'm curious, like when you build your partner program 0 to 1, like, do you feel like most of your partners are inbound, or are some of the partners you approach outbound? Like, where do you think that balance is? Because what I found in the past is that inbound partners are often the partners you actually don't want to necessarily work with, because they're like smaller, they're like shooting their shot at you as the larger company, etc. And sometimes we just need to put in the effort to actually go out and like approach these customers or these partners. But I don't know if it's the same for like a company like Airtable, for example, where everybody wants to work with you, right? Like you're the big fish, so I can assume that also some large partners will reach out to you.
So I would say I've seen amazing partners both inbound and then also through outbound motions. And this is through the 5 different companies I've worked at that, I built their partner programs up from effectively close to 0 or at 0, depending on the company. And so I found great partners in both. And then what I would say is specifically for PLG companies, we tend to see quite a lot of inbound interest. And that's because of the bottoms up approach. You see that quite often. And then at other companies, through discussions with other partner leaders, I've heard about them having to do much more of an outbound motion. So I really think it depends on the company. But ultimately, you can find great partners in both. And I think the most important piece is just to make sure that you're very clear on your customer and their challenges and what they're trying to get to as the outcome, and which partners are best suited to make the most impact on those customers in that journey. Yeah. And so whether it's inbound or outbound, if they're making that huge impact, customers will be delighted. They're going to want to work with partners more. They'll pay partners for those products or services, and your ecosystem will be sustainable and successful because of that.
Nice. It always loops back to the customer.
It really does.
Yeah. We just had Lincoln join us in the chat from the UK. So I'm glad that you're still awake and like joining us this evening on a Friday. I really appreciate it. Lincoln had a great idea. Like, I advocate for networking KPIs. You never know where conversation may lead. is networking like a KPI for your partner managers, or do you like keep that separate and just assume that that's something which you as a partner manager will just do naturally as part of your job?
That's actually an interesting point. Like we have talked about upstream KPIs before, further up the funnel, like a conversation or meeting. I specifically have not used that as a KPI, but I find that interesting as a really leading one, a really early stage leading one that could be explored. So I don't have experience to speak to that, but I do find it interesting. I will share one example specifically to customers. One thing that we do look at is whether or not a customer meeting took place with a partner as a leading indicator. So somewhat in a similar vein, but on the customer side. So I have found that to be tremendously helpful because, again, we like to look at that conversion funnel as closely as possible to understand where things could be potentially improved.
Yeah. I like that because I guess like partner meetings will happen regardless. That's just your job. And also like I think partner managers are naturally curious, but actually like goaling them on customer meetings might be like something which they don't naturally as part of their role would do. Like I think getting them in front of customers more is like really important as well.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting data point. For example, I mean, like with Airtable, it's like very structured data. So let's say you had a stage where the partner manager had a meeting with the partner. If you were able to track that, you could have a very interesting conversation about, hey, like how come that did or did not convert to a partner? What worked or what didn't? You know, what did you feel like made it a fit or not a fit for our partner program, et cetera. So I think it's interesting as a stage, and could definitely be part of that partner journey funnel that you could look at.
Yeah. Yeah, because I feel like with these kind of like up the funnel metrics, which I think is a great way of thinking about it. Like you're also laying the foundation for like this long-term game that you're playing with partnership, which actually leads us nicely into the second principle, which is to play the long game. And I was specifically like more interested around how you balance like the need to deliver in the short term versus like long-term partnership goals. Because I can imagine like if you come into a company like Airtable, they already have like millions of dollars of revenue. And if you come in as a partnership leader, they will expect you to also deliver millions of dollars immediately, right? How do you manage expectations with leadership and show them that you're actually working on the right things?
I think it's really about, again, painting that vision and making sure everyone is on the same page with regards to where you want to take things in the short, medium, and long term, and then setting expectations around these are the KPIs as you go through each of those stages. And I'll give some more anecdotal stories about why playing the long game is super important. So for many of our partners in the enterprise segment, as an example, I first started reaching out to them proactively about, like, in some cases, like 8+ months ago. 8 months ago. And that would be the initial conversation where I would, get to know them, present on why a partnership would make sense based on their customers and their practice areas and so forth. And then we would go through the agreements, the training, the accreditation. Then we would start having cadence meetings to basically drive the plan forward. And we would start engaging on opportunities. And then even after engaging on opportunities, some of those might not close initially because there's a lot of learnings in new partnerships, right? So for example, because especially in 0 to 1 builds, a lot of the first iterations, you're literally learning from effectively zero, right? Like what worked in that sales conversation, in the follow-up email, was it effective or not? Like what did we see working or not? Was the pricing at a point where the customer said, hey, the value exchange makes sense, let's move forward? The actual proposal template itself, was it effective? How did the customer react to that? And why I'm being so specific is because I've literally like lived and breathed this over the last year. I've been to 60 enterprise customer meetings myself with the pitch of partner services, right? Yeah. And it was so interesting in the beginning phases to see all the details happen in real time and see the reactions from the customers and to learn from that. And so what ends up happening is the reason why it can take time is you go through these iterations to go from, effectively what I say beginner level to probably moderate to good to really great. And it takes learning in cycles. And the way you do that is by doing things that do not scale to learn what's great to get to scale, right? So I've wrote a post about this before, but it's do things that don't scale to get to scale. It feels counterintuitive, but that's the way you want to get high touch involvement to be able to figure out what's the long-term solution. And so that's why those cycles can take actually much longer than you might think, right? There are some exceptions to the rule. Like certainly I've seen some partners come on board and in a few months we're like winning deals together, which is always really exciting to see. And some of that is, due to luck and, kind of, it's a bit of an art, right? Like you might be guessing on what a proposal should look like and you get lucky and it lands. And so that's part of the iteration process too. But ultimately, many times I've found it can take a significantly longer of time than you might think. And generally, the way I think about building great things is that it usually just doesn't happen overnight, right? No different than becoming healthy, like by working out and eating right. Again, it's not like a 2-day thing. It's probably more like a 2-year journey, right? So similarly to this, it takes a lot of investment on energy, on your time, on learnings to go again from good to great. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting how many analogies there are between like startups and partner programs. You're basically building a startup within a startup. And so I guess, during the interview, when you're applying for a role at a big company or a startup company to build partnerships, you need to set that expectation that we're going to go through these cycles and we don't necessarily have product market fit with our program yet, but we are going to iterate our way to product market fit. Because as you pointed out, like I experienced this myself, if you automate too early and you're like 2 degrees off from what the customer actually needs, you'll end up like miles away at the end. Because once you scale that up to thousands of customers, you need to go back and like change all those contracts. You need to like recertify all of them. Like it's so painful to change things at scale that it's probably better to like iterate at like a small scale of like 10 partners. So you have like a little bit of variety, but not too much going on. And then only when you actually feel like, hey, we have partner market fit, you want to go out and then actually like scale that to hundreds of partners.
Franz, I love the way you just described that. We should build a visual for that. Yeah. Because it's like you built the house with the wrong foundation and you've got to clear out the foundation and build it all over again.
Yeah.
Right. And then certainly the other risk is if you don't do that and you start automating on top of that, well, you're going to get a house that's like leaning over 5 years out. Yeah. So like that's such a great way to describe it.
Yeah. Actually, like the house analogy is so funny because Aaron Howerton, like one of the guys from the Literal Scratch podcast, recently mentioned this on his podcast as well. That if you get a CSM in and like that person helps you build a partner program, it's kind of like asking your neighbor Tom, like, "Hey, neighbor Tom has a hammer. He can help me build my house." But he's not trained in this, and they will make mistakes, and they're like very friendly, and they will help you. But again, like they're gonna like help you build, and it's gonna look like from the outside like a real partner program. But the reality is that the foundation is crooked, or like maybe the house is going to start falling apart, the roof's going to get blown off. And so actually that person is not doing you a favor. It's actually better to get somebody on board who understands partnerships and then really like iterates and works with customers and like gets into the nitty gritty details before you scale it up.
I would say, I think there's nuance in that, which is it's really important to meet your internal stakeholders cross-functionally because at the end of the day, what everyone is orienting around is how do you drive amazing customer outcomes that impact their business? Whether you're in sales, CS, sales engineering, operations, partnerships, the list goes on, right? Effectively, everyone's one team really trying to drive that. And so I think it is really important to get their feedback and to help them understand what your principles are and what your mission is with partnerships, but also to have them weigh in and give their feedback and to collaborate with you and to be a part of that journey for partnerships as well. And actually, one of the first things I did when I joined Airtable, I thought this was really critical and also highly important, was I made a list of cross-functional folks across each of the teams to meet with to understand what they were hearing from customers, what they were also hearing and interacting on with partners as well, and then to get their feedback on the initial vision of our partner program, and to take that feedback and then to also potentially iterate components of it based on that. And I found that really helpful. Also because as people weigh in and give feedback and participate, they also become part of the journey together with you and your partners, and it all ties in together as one team. And I think that's super important because, as an example, a customer success person may be working with a customer, uncover a challenge, and then think, oh, we talked about this with regards to the partner program, and I can get the partner to chime in here and help out and assist that customer. So that cross-functional alignment and having them weigh in and be a part of the process, I think, is really important.
Yeah. And it's so true. It's like, it's interesting because Jared Fuller from Reveal talked about this quite a bit. And he said, partnerships is not a team, it's a strategy. And so, like you said, I think that drives it home really a lot. There's, you got to get everybody involved. You got to get all the key stakeholders on board and make sure that they understand partnerships and they implement partnerships, because it's not your responsibility to implement all the partnerships. It's actually your responsibility to coach everybody in how to work with partners. And I love that. Yeah.
I would also add, like, I've learned from tons of people that were not in partnerships and have helped me become more clear on my thinking, and also to help guide me on modifying the partnerships program. So I think it goes both ways. And that's what I love about this role, is because you work with so many cross-functional folks, you also get the chance to learn from them what's working, what's not, and then applying that to the partner program. I'll give you an example on that as well. Like, we'll often talk with our sales team as an example and learn from them in terms of like how they're running discovery meetings or the way they're interacting with clients through the sales cycle, and then impart a lot of those learnings to our partners, which has been incredibly helpful. Which, by the way, would tie into the continuous improvement principle that I know we'll be talking about shortly, and I have a couple stories I can share on that.
The third principle, continuous improvement. I feel like we already mentioned it. I feel like they all tie in together. Like, the first one is be customer centric. The second one is play the long game. And now continuous improvement, which is the reason why you're playing the long game, because it's incredibly hard to get partnerships right. And so it will take a couple of cycles. Within like continuous improvement, I actually had one question which loops back to a blog post you posted about swim lanes. And that is channel conflict. Because at Hopin, we had this situation where we had an event services team. So we were a virtual events company, and a lot of customers asked us, hey, can you host our events for us? And initially, we outsourced all of that to our partners. But then after a while, we decided, hey, for our top customers, we might want to run these events ourselves. So we had a tiny unit which would host events for customers. And that caused a lot of conflict where like the customer, the agencies felt like threatened by that event services unit. And the event services unit felt threatened by the agencies because each one of them was worried that they would lose their job. And so we had that kind of channel conflict issue. Similar with AEs as well. There were deals where the AEs were competing with our partners. And so that issue lies like really close to me. And so I want to just ask, how do you solve that?
This is one of my favorite questions. And I actually interviewed 30 other tech partnerships folks to get their feedback on this. And then I did a baseline on it, and I created this beautiful Miro board to basically show the different ways that companies do it. And so shout out to Miro, my previous employer, wonderful product. It's beautiful the way it's built out. And what was really interesting about that, the learning was, it really depends on the company. And I'll share some anecdotes, but also a visual to help explain this. So I'll pull this up.
Yeah, I have to say, I really appreciate the visuals. Like, the blog posts are great, but the visuals really drive it home. Like, I actually find myself afterwards going back to the blog post just to see the visual again, to then remember what is in the blog post and how I would apply it.
I have really good news for you. There's a lot of visuals coming. So I've meticulously like batched a bunch of posts for basically a year out. So plenty of content coming. It's all to help folks out there in the partnerships world. I'm really excited to share with you.
Yeah, if you haven't yet, sign up to partnerprinciples.com, a weekly newsletter.
Nice. Thanks for the shout out, Franz.
Yeah,
just happy to help people. So on partner swim lanes, the reality of what I've seen out there is it really depends on the company. Let me give you a couple of examples. There are some companies, like as an example, VMware, Cisco, Microsoft, like heavily VAR, reseller, partner-led. The majority of their business is through partners, as an example. There are other companies that have, decacorn valuations, growing at rapid rates, in the cloud business heavily, right? That, for example, would have a services unit that would be in-house, and they would typically work on, for example, really large engagements, and that would help them understand what's happening directly from their customer to be closer to the specific solution build, And then what they would have is, a large percentage of their services delivery, as an example, would be driven by partners. So it's effectively a hybrid model, but largely driven by partners. And then there are other models where all of that is driven by partners as well. And that has also worked out well. And then there are other models where they're actually primarily direct, as an example, like a primary direct selling motion. And then a smaller sliver is resell that is more reactive and opportunistic based on things like the sector in which you're selling in. So as an example, public sector very often will go out to bid and they'll want 3 reseller bids, and you'll typically need a distributor to aggregate that process to make it easier for you as a vendor. And so a company might primarily, for example, in that last example, have like most of their direct business and commercial where their reps just sell it to the customer. But ultimately in public sector, it might be, effectively almost all reseller led, right? So really what this comes down to is it's company dependent. And the way I try to think about it is, one, again, first orient around the customer because that's the most important thing. But once you do that, then start thinking about what are the potential swim lanes where you might want partners to lead or be all in on partners, right? And so an example of that first is geography. So for one region, let's say you don't have any folks on your team that are fluent in that language or regionally based, that might be an example where you might say, hey, let's completely lean in with partners, both on resell and the services and referral side, et cetera. And, that could be, again, by larger region, it could be by country. That's one way to carve it out. Another one is by segmentation. So you might say, hey, our sales team is going to be specifically really focused on, enterprise and selling direct there, but mid-market and SMB, there's so many accounts out there. The way we're going to get to scale is through the reach of our, local value-added resellers. Let's build out that program and have them take on and serve the mid-market and SMB segment. So that's another example of a swim lane.
That's something which we've seen as well, actually, just to touch on the first two. Like for country, I think language is a really important one as well, because we actually had this at Hopin as well. Like one of our German agencies, shout out to Smart Events, they were handling a lot of our German customers, and there was no complaint from our events team or CSMs because they just don't speak the language. And so that was a pretty easy one to create a swim lane around, because if the customer wanted German speaking support, we just sent them over to one of our German agencies. And similarly with the segmentation, like we just had a key accounts list of like several hundred customers where we said like, hey, these customers belong to us. Like the events are so crucial for the virality and the brand that we can't risk having them outsourced. And so that was a nice way of like finding this common ground with agencies. I do have a question around it though. Like, how do you communicate those swim lanes to a partner? Like, how do you make sure that the partner actually buys into them as well?
In the past, what I've done is I have a visual that is very similar. And what I end up doing is effectively drawing these lines that show like, hey, this is where we're going to lean in with partners and either go all in as an example, or, we expect X% to be done with partners. And so I think that's really important, because when you think about it from the partner perspective, right, they have a lot of vendors asking them to be partners, and they only have so much time, resources, and energy. And so they have to make a business decision on which platforms and strategic partners am I going to go invest in. And what they want to know is, if I'm making this investment in headcount, in energy, and time, and so forth, that ultimately the return is going to be there. And understanding clearly where the swim lanes are makes it much easier for them to make that decision, right? And I'll give you an example. If they're experts within, let's say, the retail sector, and you've decided you want to completely carve that out to partners, well, then that makes them feel really confident that by working together, assuming there's enough opportunity flow and ultimately a profitable practice they can build around it, that they're not going to have to compete, right? And ultimately that they're going to be able to build a sustainable business around that. So I think being really open and communicative and even literally showing visuals around it can be tremendously helpful, to get that executive buy-in from a partner to be able to invest and move forward with your company.
Yeah. If anything, my main takeaway from today's session is to use more visuals. Like just get them out there and like visualize it to the partner, and also explain to them that this is for their benefit. Like this is like for the partner's benefit, to make sure that you invest your resources accordingly and you don't chase after deals where afterwards you might have to hand them over. You're going to be upset. We're going to be upset. Like avoiding conflict is in everybody's interest in that moment. I know we're at time. We're actually over time. And yeah, you have shared so many great visuals. Like Lincoln, for example, has said he screenshotted so many of the templates already. So where can people find all these visuals? Where can people like learn more about your content, Nelson?
Yeah, I'm actually releasing a new visual next week, and you just have to subscribe to partnerprinciples.com. That's my personal newsletter where I just love to share my learnings in real time about partnerships. So one of the things I'm a big fan of is building in public, because I get immediate feedback on it. I can see what's helping other people as well. It's a great way to share learnings, but also get a lot of learnings in return. People have emailed me back with like their learnings, which is helpful. And so if you subscribe to that newsletter, you'll definitely be seeing the visuals sent to you there as well. So hopefully that's helpful.
And email back. I feel like that's the greatest way to give back as well to anybody who shared valuable knowledge, because it's a great way to test your thinking. Like you said, like the 3 C's expanded to the 4 C's based on feedback from LinkedIn. So there's a real way to like co-create all of these things together. And yeah, I wanted to give a shout out to our wonderful viewers today, Galina, Lincoln, Clinton, and Gabriella, and everybody else who's watching live. You could have been anywhere in the world and you chose to be with us, and that means a lot to me. And so thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Nelson, for taking time out of your busy day to share all these visuals and frameworks. There's a lot to digest. And if you want to join us for another episode of the partnership before the end of the year, make sure to join us next Wednesday, where I'm going to interview Antonio Cardidat, who is the Senior Director of Channel Programs at Megaport, for a last Christmas special. Thanks so much for joining us, Nelson, and thanks everybody for watching.
Thanks all.